are now listening to an inspirational message from the Greater Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church, where Dr. Michael Wesley Sr. is pastor. Please join the service in progress.
We have been on a journey through the book of Genesis in our church, and we're continuing with that journey. We are now at a place where we've been talking about the life of Joseph. And so we're in the 39th chapter this morning, Genesis chapter 39. We'll read the first 6 verses in your hearing, and we'll speak from those thoughts. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him and made him overseer over his house. And all that he had, he put into his hand. And it came to pass from that time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. This is the word of God for the people of God. I'm preaching this morning from the subject, blessed by God and favored by man. Blessed by God and favored by man. Those are two different sides of the coin. To be blessed by God is one thing. But to also, in addition to the blessing of God is enough. It really is. It's more than enough for me to be blessed by God as much as I can handle. But in addition to that, to find favor with a human, and the combination of those two become unbeatable in terms of what is necessary in order for us to really live life on the highest plane. And to be blessed by God, to be favored by man, is to live right. If we live right, if we do right things, if we treat people in right ways, if we allow the principles of righteousness to inhabit our life, then we'll find that it is possible that we can receive both the blessing of God and the favor of the human. The 37th chapter of Genesis ended with the brothers of Joseph selling him into slavery to the Midianites or the Ishmaelites. They're the same group. And those men took him down into Egypt, and there they sold him again. And he was bought on the auction block by an Egyptian officer, the chief officer of Pharaoh's prison. And his name was Potiphar. And there, young Joseph, 17 years old, found himself in the midst of what I believe had to have been a most dreaded time in his life. Here he was. He had been the favorite son of his father. He had earned the right to oversee his brothers. He had worn the coat of many colors. He had lived in a favorable position. And now here he is at the bottom of the barrel. Slavery at any point is not a welcome experience for anyone. But to be honest with you, if I had to choose between being Joseph as a slave in Egypt or his brothers in Canaan, I would choose Joseph. because Joseph in Egypt had two things going for him. He had the character that had developed in him, and he had the awareness that God was with him. All his brothers had, on the other hand, in Egypt was the bloody coat that they would now lie to their father about to try to convince him that some wild animal has devoured his son Joseph. And you know how it is when you start lying, you have to keep lying. And so his brothers are going to be on a spiral downwardly of shame and guilt and lying and all the other things. While on the other hand, Joseph, even though he's going to be in a circumstance, his life is going to take a whole new trajectory because he will experience the blessing of God and the favor of man. I think that's a good place. I really do. But where is this that Joseph is now? In what circumstances are he going to be forced to have to navigate? He's in Egypt. Egypt, we mentioned Egypt many times in the book of Genesis, and we mentioned Egypt several times as now. But Egypt is an ancient nation. It's part of antiquity. It is difficult to date the founding of Egypt, but there are historians and scientists who believe that the dates of the founding of Egypt was somewhere between 3100 BC and 5000 BC. The exact date cannot be really pinpointed, but it is clear that there were 31 dynasties that ruled over Egypt. And by the time Joseph shows up, it is the 15th dynasty. Egypt has been a nation for at least 1,000 years before Joseph shows up. Not only is it an ancient nation, but it is a wealthy nation. It is a nation that is rich first in its natural resources. The Nile River runs through the gambit of Egypt, and often its banks would overflow. And when its banks would overflow, it would pour out with it the rich soil along the riverbanks, and therefore agriculture was really good. And when the Nile was not overflowing, it was an irrigation system that allowed crops of all kinds, wheat, barley, corn, and all grew. So Egypt was filled with the necessary foodstuffs that it needed in order to be a self-sustaining nation. Not only that, but further to the north, as you move farther, there was gold that was throughout the land of Egypt. It was a wealthy nation. The banks not only produced extra rich soil, but there was also the necessary means for architecture and development. Clay was found in abundance. So building was made easy. Not only was Egypt a wealthy nation, but it was also a nation that was steeped in the study. The founding of medicine was there. It was a cultural center. Some years, dynasties earlier, the fourth dynasty, the great pyramids had begun to be erected. And there were many metropolitan cities. Memphis and Thebes were there. It was a cultural mecca. It was an art gallery. It was a city that was also pagan. Pagan because it had many gods. It was a polytheistic worship experience. They had so many gods in Egypt that you could not even remember all of the names. But at least 10 of those gods were whipped by Jehovah when he sent Moses down during the Exodus. Oh yes, they had animal gods, and they had moon gods, and they had sun gods like Ra, and they had animal gods like Milcom, and they had others whose names are familiar in history. And this was a place of great paganism, and this young 17-year-old boy is brought there. It would have been natural. It would have been easy for him to try to fit in, do whatever's necessary to make some advancement. It would have been all right. It would have been all right for him to be dishonest, for him to be scheming and gaming, to do whatever's necessary. Who would have thought or expected anything different? But Joseph didn't do such a thing. And it wasn't that family was there to watch. It was that he had character. And he had God. as his focus. And whenever you have character, and whenever you have God in your heart as the primary focus, it does not matter where you are. There's so many people who are making excuses today and who are crying that they can't make it because of circumstances or limitations or where they are. If God is with you, it does not matter where you are. He is able to take you from the guttermost and raise you to the uttermost. God takes nobodies and make them somebody. This story, we like to hear the stories of rags to riches, but this story is a story in the reverse. It's a story of riches to rags and then to riches. From the coat of many colors to the clothes of a slave. And from the slave clothes to the robes of the palace. This man's story is before us today. Those gods, Cyrus, the chief of the god of the Nile, Nu, another one of the gods of the Nile, Gabe, the god of the land, Ra, the sun god. I won't go through all those boys' names, but it's not important. The point is that Joseph was here. And Joseph's elevation, and in particular in the text today, is based on, here it is, the blessing of God on everything he did. Man, how would you like to feel, how would you like to know that everything you touched, God was going to bless? Wouldn't it change your outlook? Wouldn't it change your pursuit? Wouldn't it change how you feel and how you approach things if somehow you had the assurance that it was going to all turn out right? And God blessed everything that Joseph did. 7 times in this 39th chapter, it is mentioned that Joseph, God was blessing. First in chapter 2, verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph and he prospered. We see it again in verse 3. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes. We see it again in verse 5. The Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. We see it again and again that the blessing of the Lord was upon everything that Potiphar had. And after this had been said 5 times, there's an interruption. Because that's when Joseph had a problem with Miss Potiphar. But that didn't stop the blessing of God. Because you keep on reading in verse 21. You see the Lord was with him. You see again in verse 23. Even though now he's in prison, we read again that the warden was speaking. The warden paid no attention to anything that was under Joseph's care. Because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in everything that he did. Man, what a blessing to know that God is with you in the difficulties, in the challenges, in all things that there is. Here it is. The interesting thing about this, the blessing, is that it indicates that sometimes the blessing of God is on somebody else before it's on you. You know, God will bless other people for you. He really will. God will bless other people because of you. How many know it's the truth? Yes, it is. Listen, I was reading the account, the commentaries of Martin Luther, who was the great reformer of the 1500s and 1600s. Martin Luther says that God will bless others because of you. And he cites this incident of Joseph. And he uses other biblical characters to help us to see. He says that God blessed Jacob. God blessed Laban's household because of Jacob. He said, Jacob, well, one day Laban looked up and he said to Jacob, he said, please don't leave. Don't go back to your home. He said, because I've seen through divination that I'm being blessed because of you. Just tell me what your wages are and I'll pay you gladly. Because this man realized that he was being blessed because of someone else who knew the Lord. Martin Luther says of his own country, of Germany in his day, he said Germany was being spared from ruin in spite of all of its evil and the evil practices of his day because of the spillover of the gospel that came forth during the Reformation. I know it's the truth of the United States. This country, in spite of all that it has done wrong, is being blessed. Because on Sunday morning, like today, churches all over, somebody is there calling on the name of the Lord. And the nation, which once was founded upon the principle, in God we trust, even though we now say in God we turn our back, is still being blessed because of Christians. And let me come a little closer here, because the truth is you're sitting here looking prim and proper, but some of you are blessed because of the prayers of someone else. To be honest with you, it was grandmama, it was mama, it was big mama, somebody else when I was foolish and crazy and wasn't thinking about myself that was somewhere calling on his name. And God heard their prayers and spared me. And I'll be honest with you, and spared you. The world don't believe this is true, but it is the truth. Whether the world believe it or not, people are blessed because of other people. And Potiphar's household was blessed because of Joseph. And what I find interesting here, what I really find interesting is that Potiphar, a pagan, an Egyptian, praises Jehovah, praises the God of heaven and earth because of Joseph. Let me come your way. Who's praising God because of you? Who is giving God some glory because you're in their environment? Who on your job give God praise because they can see that you're living godly lives? Who in your community give God thanks when they see you walk by? Who in your family praises God because of you? Joseph's influence, the blessing of God was upon him, and it even caused a man. See, look at this, look at this. It would appear that Egypt, with all of its wealth, with all of its study, with all of its culture, with all of its antiquity, with all of its history, with all of its influences, would have influenced this young 17-year-old boy. What 17-year-old in here would not go to a major city and not be gripped by it? I'll be honest with you, I left here at about 17. I went to Nashville. It wasn't country and western, it was college, baby. And man, for a little while, I forgot about the God of heaven and earth. On Sunday, I was in another church. I was at Bedside Baptist every Sunday. Somebody here knows it's the truth. After partying on Saturday night, Bedside Baptist Sunday morning, regular member. But look at Joseph. This is what is so interesting. He did not allow the culture to influence him, but he is a catalyst of influence of people who were steeped in the culture and causing them to praise his God. So here's what I want to help you to see secondly. The second thing we see here, that not only was Joseph blessed by God, but Joseph was favored by man as well. I mean, and Potiphar in particular. Potiphar buys Joseph off the slave block. He doesn't know Joseph. He doesn't know anything about this boy. He doesn't come with a resume in his hand. He doesn't come with character stamped on his forehead. He doesn't come with any of the credentials that would suggest that he is all of that and a bag of chips. He's just a common slave, just like everybody else. And at first, he comes into Potiphar's quarters or wherever the slaves live, and that's where Potiphar encounters him. But Potiphar gradually notices something different about him, that God was with Joseph, and that good things were happening to Potiphar all because of it. Look what the scriptures say. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and gave him success in everything that he had, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. At the very end of Luke's gospel, here's a parallel. In Luke's gospel, chapter 2, where it summarizes the life of Jesus when he was a young boy at 12, said that Jesus had been down in Jerusalem with his parents, Mary and Joseph, to the feast. And they left him behind thinking that he was in their company. And then when they found him 3 days later, they said, "Son, why did you treat us like this?" And he said, "Didn't you know I had to be about my father's business?" And then the Bible says in that summary statement that he went down with them and was subject unto them. And Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. Now listen, I want you to pay attention to that word grew. Jesus grew. Joseph grew. That implies the passage of time. And let me help every young person in here today to understand, you don't just get there immediately because you show up. But with time and with consistency, elevation can be in your path. Let me help you. Look at Joseph. Look at Joseph. If we look at the progression of this thing right here, you'll see that Joseph's fortune did not happen overnight. Look at what happens. First of all, the Lord was with Joseph. And he prospered. And Joseph was a new slave just coming on board like this. He had no particular responsibilities. He just like everybody else that was purchased off the auction block. But it's not long before Potiphar sees something different about him and says, He eventually moves him from the slave quarter and brings him to his household. And not long after that, at some point, as he becomes a part of Potiphar's household, he is now a house servant. You do know there are two types. You could be a house servant or you could be a field servant. Joseph is not in the field. He's in the house. So he's learning domesticated processes. And not long after that, look at what happens in verse 3. There's some further progression. Now in the house, his master Potiphar recognizes him and gives him some additional responsibilities. In the fourth situation, Potiphar appoints him to become his personal attendant. He's advancing over a period of time. And then finally we see that Potiphar sees this boy is the real deal. And he places him over everything that he has. Potiphar is not even concerned with anything in his whole household. Only the things that he eats and the things that he drinks, because he realizes that God was with this boy. Now, this happened over time. How long? How long over time? Well, Joseph was sold into slavery at age 17. We know that 2 chapters later, the scripture tells us that Pharaoh takes him out of prison and elevates him to a position of authority, and he's of the age 30. And we know that he spent 2 years in prison. So if you want to know how long he worked for Potiphar, you take 17 minus 30, or 30 minus 17, and then take 2 more years for the years in prison, and you've come up with that Joseph worked for Potiphar 11 years. 11 years he was in Potiphar's house. Now look, he's advancing all of this time. It's a gradual process. I wish young people would hear this today, because so many walk in and think they ought to be the CEO. You come in slave clothes and think, oh, what's wrong with y'all? Y'all hadn't recognized that this is me. I'm here. I'm supposed to be the boss. Get out there and cut the grass. You know, the important thing that I want you to understand here about time is that there is a reasonableness to advance us. And so many people expect God to advance them immediately. But here's what I want you to hear. God will advance us as fast as he can. But that depends on what he has to work with. If God has entrusted something in you and you're not using it, you can't expect God to move you forward. So many people are upset. I mean, you could be further than you are, but you got to use what God gives. There are so many people who could have more money, but you got to manage the money you have. Some people could increase in talent, but you got to use the talent that you have. Every time it's time for you to use the talent, I ain't going to do that. And you want God to move you forward. When you got a long period of time, like 11 years, you have to demonstrate the principles of consistency and rightness. I mean, see, Joseph was focused. He had his priorities in the right place. His number one priority was to please God. And so every day when your priorities are straight, it keeps you from getting off base. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter who you're around. It doesn't matter what's going on. As long as you know who you are, whose you are, and what you're there for. can stay focused. And when you stay focused, right things come. So this boy runs in the household. He does a great job for 11 years. Somebody said, well, why you keep saying 11? Because it was in the 11th year that Miss Potiphar couldn't handle it no more. And he had a little problem. That's a subject for another day. Because I want you to know that that was just a temporary setback. And may I help you understand that setbacks will come. It will come in the best of people, but that still shouldn't take you out of who you are, off the track of what you're trying to do. Some years ago, there was a crazy illustration. There was a man who was a boss, and he fired a secretary for refusing to type letters that said that the company had shipped items that they had not shipped. The girl lost her job. But not long after that, the boss called her back because he had a job as a cashier. And he needed someone with integrity. And even though he had gotten angry with her because she wouldn't lie for him, he hired her back because he needed someone who would be honest in another situation. So I'm just telling you, listen, sometimes when you stand for what's right, you may suffer some consequences. There might be some temporary setback, but you hold on. The blessing of God produces the favor with man. So I want you to help you see that the emphasis is not so much on Joseph, it's on the blessing of God. But if we're going to take a look at Joseph, we might as well understand that Joseph also was advanced because Joseph worked hard. Somebody said worked hard. I know that word frightens a lot of people today, but Joseph worked hard. He really did. You got to see him. Just see him. Come up here. Here he was. He's 17. He comes into a land. He can't even speak the language, so his communication skills are limited. But Joseph is a hard worker. He's conscientious. He takes pride in himself. And he gets around and he learns about the language. He wants to learn the language. Whenever he's given a job, he wants to know, what does culture say this needs to be done? And how do I do it right? And how do I make it consistently well so that my master prospers? He continually worked. Luther, again, in his commentary, writing about Joseph and his incident, said that Joseph was the type of fellow who would be the first one up in the morning. He would get up when the rest of the...
Hope you enjoyed the broadcast. You have been listening to a message from the Greater Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church, where we are reaching the world for Christ, located at 2135 Jefferson Avenue Southwest, Birmingham, Alabama 35211. For a copy of a CD or DVD, you can reach us at 205-925-5972 or visit us on the web at www.greatershallow.org for an uplifting message. Please join us for the next broadcast.